In this video, we're going to set up Windows deployment services on our server, and we're also going to set up our first boot image and our install image so that we can have these ready for when we're going to start deploying software, our Windows operating system, over the network. This is essentially a network installation, and a lot of times this is a lot faster and it can be customized a lot more than installing software such as Windows over a CD or a DVD or even a USB flash drive. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to have our server manager open, and we also need a copy of a Windows ISO file. In this case, I'm using Windows 2012 R2 evaluation version. This is going to let me set up that deployment, that installation image. So instead of burning this to a DVD, I'm going to be able to push this over the network using this Windows deployment services. Now you may notice I already have a couple of services on my server. Now these should not get in our way a whole lot, except there's one thing that we will probably want to have when we get started, and that is Active Directory. I have a domain set up, and this particular server that I'm on happens to be my domain controller. Now it wouldn't have to be your domain controller, and you wouldn't even actually have to be on a domain for this to work, but I happen to be on a domain, so you may notice certain screens might look a little different if you don't happen to be on a domain. So let's get started. Just like any role or feature in Windows, we can go to Manage and then Add Roles and Features, or you can click on a shortcut here, and the Add Roles and Features wizard window pops up. We're going to create a role-based or feature-based installation, and we're going to install this on this server in this case, which is a Server 2012 R2 Data Center evaluation copy. We're going to scroll on down here and choose the Windows Deployment Services option. And when we do that, this window pops up. Now, this isn't any big deal. All this is saying is when I install Windows Deployment Services, you might want the remote server administration tools as well. So it wants to bring these along with it, and we can choose not to if we wanted to, but really we're going to need those. Those are going to be the main tools that we use to work with our server and get everything set up. So we're going to add those features as well. We'll click Next, and since it already tossed in some features on that prior page, we don't need to go and select anything else here. We should have everything we need. You may have different things already installed, and that's fine. Anything that the Windows Deployment Services service will need will have been brought along in that prior screen. Now you'll notice the WDS pops up over here on the side as we're going through our list of tasks, and it'll explain a little bit about this. You might want to stop and read that. The most important thing that you will need to know about Windows Deployment Services is that it is based on using DHCP. When a computer starts up, if it doesn't have a static address, or certainly if it doesn't have an operating system, it doesn't know what address it should be using, it doesn't know what network it's on, it doesn't know who to talk to get those next pieces of information. So you'll notice here, deployment server requires that DNS and DHCP services are going to be available. Now, if you don't use DHCP on your server and you're using it from a different server, this can still work. There's a couple of different options with that, and we'll get to that once we get things installed. But keep in mind, DHCP is critical to this process. You'll need to understand your DHCP configuration to make a couple of choices later on. When you install the WDS role, you're given the option for the deployment server as well as the transport server. In our case, since we want both of these services on the one server, I'm going to leave those both checked. But here's where we get the option of which server is going to handle the deployment part, where we're actually deploying out our server, and which server is going to handle some of the core networking. In our case, it's both. And then we get a confirmation screen, and you can choose if you'd like to restart the destination server if it's required. going to leave that checked off for now, and I'm going to let this installation proceed. Now it might take just a couple of minutes. It's a little faster on an SSD, but on a traditional hard drive it should still go pretty quick because it's not actually setting up any of the Windows installation images yet. That's something that we have to do later on. So depending on what you want to deploy, if you want to deploy Windows 7, Windows 10, Windows Server, all of these different images are going to be brought along by different ISO files that we plug in here. So my installation succeeded and it didn't ask me for a reboot, which is always handy. And I can click close. And you'll notice WDS is now installed and online. Now, the important place to get our work done with this is over here in this list of tools. You'll notice the Windows Deployment Services has been added in. We can open this window, and in here is the list of all of our Windows Deployment Services servers, and this is my server. And then here's any Active Directory pre-staged devices. This is where you would set anything up if you wanted to pre-stage a device before you even initiate the installation. You can have that ready to go. And when I click on my server, it says Windows Deployment Services is not configured. The service is there, but nothing is configured yet. I need to right click and configure this server to be a WDS server. We're here in another wizard, and there's a couple of things that you're going to take a look at here. We are a member of an Active Directory domain. In my case, I am a domain controller, and there is active Dhcp on my network, and there is active DNS on my network, and I happen to be using NTFS as my file system, so I'll be able to store my Windows images there. If any of these are not set, then you'll need to address those first. In my case, I can choose to integrate this server with Active Directory. One of the nice things about this is once you deploy Windows onto a new machine, and in my case I'm going to deploy onto a virtual machine, when you have this set up, those machines can automatically become members of your Active Directory domain. So it saves you another step later on. And depending on what your group policies in Active Directory are set to do, once you deploy Windows, it may choose to configure a bunch of other software for you. So you could really have things all set up and ready to go. Or you could choose to make this a standalone server completely separate from Active Directory. I'm going to go with the standalone server option in this case, just so we can see outside of this Active Directory system how this would work. That way some of my Active Directory requirements aren't even necessarily having an effect on what I'm doing here. The first thing we choose here is where are our remote installation files going to be located. Now this can be on your C drive, it can be on a separate hard drive if you want. It's going to need to have a lot of space. As it says here, choose a partition that's large enough to hold all of the images that you will have. So if you have a lot of different Windows images that you want to put into your WDS library and deploy from, it's going to need to be a pretty big hard drive. Now remember, when you're deploying, you might make a choice to use a traditional hard drive that has more capacity but maybe slower speed, because oftentimes we're still going to be throttled back by the speed of our network. And the other thing that kind of comes into play here is even a mechanical hard drive will read at a pretty good pace, as long as it's reading the same thing and maybe only one thing at a time. If it has to jump around and do a lot of different things, sometimes a mechanical hard drive won't be quite as effective. In my case, I only have the one hard drive and I only have the C drive, so I'm going to choose the default. Now it's going to give me a warning here that that is my Windows system volume. For best performance, I should pick something else, but I really don't have to. I just need to be aware that I am potentially loading up my system volume with all of these images. The next screen that we see here is what are we going to do with our PXE server? This is our pre-boot execution environment server. Now, how do we want to handle our clients? Now, at first you might choose not to respond to any client computers and respond later once you have things set up. Or you can respond to only known client computers, computers that you've kind of pre-staged and already set up. Or you can respond to all client computers whether you know them or not. That way, if any computer on your network boots up, you're willing to provide that image. Now, with this one, you can also require administrator approval. That way, if some unknown computer does jump in and try to install Windows through your WDS, you can still have to go in and approve that machine. It'll go into this pending devices space. And that's kind of cool, because that way you can kind of leave it open and you won't have to pre-stage, but you can then go back and approve. My environment happens to be strictly a test environment, and I know exactly what machines are going to be on my network. I don't have any concerns about unknown computers because I know everything that's going to be doing any of this PXE booting on my particular network. You might have a staging network that is designed just for this, and you would be able to make the same choice that I'm making, where let anybody in and let anybody connect. So I'm going to leave the require administrator approval off. It's going to save me a step, but in a production environment you're going to want some type of approval so that somebody doesn't bring in some computers and start installing with all of your images without your knowledge. We're starting some services and everything is configured. Now, at this point, we have the option to add some images to the server right away. I'm not going to do this one because I want to show you how to do this after the fact. You should know how to do this after the fact, because if you're in a situation where you complete the wizard and you want to change something later, you shouldn't have to go back to the initial configuration to add these images. You should know where to find them anyway. So I'm going to click Finish, and I'm going to expand out my server now. I see that my server has that green arrow showing that it's on, and I've got a couple of different things here. We talked about a few of them already. The install images. This is the installations of Windows that are going to be available on my network. The boot images. These are the ones that are going to boot a pre-installation environment for Windows, so we can load up and connect to the network and pull that Windows installation over. It's kind of like a mini Windows that boots up so that you can go through the installation wizard. We've got our pending devices if we need that administrator approval. We've got pre-staged devices that we can set up beforehand. We can configure a multicast transmission if we want to push these out to a lot of different machines all at one time. That can be pretty handy because we send it out once from our server and many machines could pick up on this image. We could deploy 30 machines and really only send out all of those packets one time. And then we also have our drivers section here, where we can actually add in drivers for things like network cards or hard drive controllers that might not be in that pre-installation boot environment. That can be really handy if you're using some hardware that Windows doesn't quite know what to do with from the beginning. And then we have our Active Directory pre-staged devices as well. Now I'm keeping Active Directory out of this as much as possible, but we still have the capability of tying in if we want. So the first thing I need to do is I need to get a boot image. I need something that when my computers boot off of the network, that can boot instead. Instead of choosing their hard drive, instead of choosing a CD or DVD or a USB key, I'm going to choose this network boot image. So in order to do this, I can choose to add a boot image. In Windows, we want to find the exact file location. We want to go into the sources file in this disk. Now, what I'm looking at here is just an ISO. I'm not actually looking at my actual CD. So what I really need to do is I need to mount this image. Let's try that again. There we go. Not quite sure what happened there, but it worked this time. So now when I right clicked and chose mount, it actually put this this DVD as my E drive. So even though it's not really its own drive letter, I've mounted it as this E drive. So it's as if I'm looking at the contents of that disk. I don't have to burn it to a disk. I don't have to use a slow CD or DVD drive to make this work. So now I can browse to that location, and it is in the E drive. It's actually e:\sources. I can browse to that, or I can just type that in now, since I know what that is. And there's actually a file in that directory if we take a look, and it's called boot.wim. Let's see this in slightly a different way. It's going to be one of the bigger files in there. Let's sort it by size, and we can see boot.wim is right here. That e:\sources tells me exactly where I'm looking. Oops, looks like I do need that exact file. boot.wim. I can handle that. And what it does is it detects that this is a 64-bit image that I'm working with. So I can name that something different if I want. I could call it the Windows 2012 R2 setup if I want, just so that I can identify it a little bit more clearly. I'm going to leave the default for now. And then I click Next. There's the summary, just telling us what we're going to be doing. And then adding this boot image usually goes pretty quickly because it's not that big of a file. When we look back here at our file size, this one was 235 meg, so it should go pretty quick. When we set up that install WIM, that's the one that's going to take quite a bit of time. Now my boot image is here, and it's set and it's online. I can do the same with an install image. There's nothing there by default, but I can right click and add an install image. And what it says is I can add an install image, but I need an install image group. So maybe I call my group Windows Server, and this is going to be one of the possible Windows servers that I can deploy is 2012 R2. And then I go and find that same location. You can type it in, or you can browse for it. Mine is e:\sources /install.wim. WIM is a Windows image, by the way. Now you see this here, and it kind of looks like they're all the same. It's kind of hard to tell the difference here. And you can't really maximize this window, but if you want, you can scroll over and see what those real names are. 2012 R2 Server Standard Core, 2012 R2 Server Standard, 2012 R2 Server Data Center Core, 2012 R2 Server Data Center. So even though it doesn't say it, these are the ones with the GUI. The standard and the data center. The ones that mention core, including that very top one, are only the Windows Server Core editions. And then the description is the same. It just gives you that same information about what is really there. So which of these images do I really want to deploy? Do I want all four? And if I want all four, it's going to have to copy all four. So that's going to take a little bit longer. So in my case, for the deployment that I want to do, I am choosing to only include Data Center. And I'm going to leave the default name, which, although it's not the most clear thing in the world exactly what this one is, because it is server with a GUI, I'm going to leave those default names. Here's my summary, and now I'm adding that Windows image. This one does take a lot longer, especially on a hard drive, a mechanical hard drive. I'm on a solid state, and we'll see it goes a little bit quicker, but it will still take a decent amount of time, because not only is it checking the integrity, which means it has to load it all into memory and make sure that everything is exactly the ones and zeros that it's expecting, it also has to do that big file copy, and it's going to copy that install.wim file over into my directory. And it does take a little bit longer, like I said, on a mechanical hard drive. but it went pretty quick for me, so I'm happy about that. Now I have my install image here, Windows Server, my boot image here. This is actually my image group as we set up earlier, and then my boot image. So at this point I've set up my server as much as I need to. The only thing I haven't really done anything with is DHCP. There may be a slight modification where you need to actually set some DHCP options. In my case, I didn't need that because I'm not running a DHCP server on this particular device. In the next video, we'll take a look at how this deployment actually goes through and how that PXE process begins.